Have you ever heard of Chekhov's gun? It's a dramatic principle that states that you shouldn't spend time on something that is completely irrelevant to the story. The way Chekhov himself put it, if you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. This principle gets to the heart of a very basic design philosophy by which many writers live by, the setup and the payoff. Here's a quick example. Let's say I have a story where a character's superpower becomes apparent and useful by the 11th hour, but I also don't want to come right out and say what that superpower is until that moment. I could plant instances of hints at what his superpower is sporadically during the build-up to the climax. That way there is evidence that the superpower exists, and it doesn't just end up being a deus ex machina. If that superpower was, for sake of an easy example, the ability to identify any smell in the world from a single whiff, I can have that character multiple times throughout the story use that ability without making a big deal out of it. You know, he's able to smell a dish and determine the ingredients, stuff like that. Setup. Then, at the climax, when that character smells the gunpowder that is about to blow them and the other main characters to smithereens, thereby saving everyone thanks to his warning and subsequent escape, the payoff would feel earned. This is a simple example, but it's so important to grasp because my entire first video was a setup. But what's the payoff, you ask? Well, have you ever heard of epileptic trees? It's another trope, this time about theories. Back when Lost was still on, there was a theory that these trees were having epileptic seizures. I know that sounds phenomenally dumb, but it's true. Lost was the kind of TV show that encouraged grasping at straws like that, but a lot of the most highly praised media in our history does this too. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which has numerous ways you can interpret any given scene. The important thing to understand about epileptic trees is that just because a theory is really out there doesn't mean that evidence cannot be found for it, or that the theory won't be accepted by the majority of the fanbase if there's a compelling evidence. The trope namer isn't a good example of this, obviously, but something that I think is actually what I spent like 20 minutes talking about at the beginning of my Metal Gear Solid 5 video, the idea that the game was unfinished. There was certainly some evidence for it, and through a combination of numerous factors, most of the fan base decided that it was true, at least for a while. I presented my counter-argument there, feel free to go watch it, but the point is that no type of media is exempt from epileptic trees, and they can actually be quite captivating if given enough thought and time. If you haven't put two and two together yet, I'm just going to come right out and say it. I lied in my first video about this game. Like, a lot. Most of my theories are completely bunk. Some of the lies were devious and subtle, but some of them were glaringly obvious if you were paying attention. But were you fooled, even though I showed you the entire game before I started going off the deep end with my theories? That's the real question. And there's plenty of evidence that I already planned to make this video, from this tweet that I made right before the first video went out, the message at the end of the video, and the scheduled reveal I had on my channel, which if you didn't see it in real time, I uncovered the title one character at a time leading up to its release. So before we get into roasting myself, here's some stuff to think about. How can you spot a bad theory? Most of the bad theories I've encountered, including my own presented in the last video, check off at least one of these three boxes, regardless of how much compelling evidence there is for it. 1. The theory uses flaws from the story or presentation in order to explain other flaws in the story or presentation, thereby justifying both flaws. I'm going to go into more depth later, but you can see this at a glance in how I use this graphical glitch as fuel for a theory that explains a flaw in the story, a plot hole about how Emma survives in space without oxygen for at least 13 minutes. 2. The theory's main goal is to fill in plot holes. Ditto on my Emma isn't real theory here. It was born out of the sole goal of explaining a pretty enormous plot hole. It can certainly explain other things, even paints the game in an interesting light if you take it to a logical conclusion, but the theory was only originally devised to explain a plot hole, which is a pretty big indicator that it is flawed from the start. And finally, 3. The theory has no in-text payoff. There's plenty of evidence for my theories because I bent the game to my ideas and forced it into place. But just looking at the game on its own terms, the idea that Emma and the aliens don't exist not only doesn't work from a textual standpoint, it also doesn't mean anything when you get right down to it. The events still take place in the same exact way, and they still don't really make any sense in the end. Now, let me dive deeper and explain in detail why these theories are bad. So let's start with the aliens again. When I said they enact no real-world change, that was a blatant lie. Jim says,
"Did you hear the noise too?"
We did. A few times, actually.
which basically just proves that the aliens can affect people other than Sam and Emma, even on a station where Sam is deactivated. Alternate Josh also heard the bring her message as evidenced by
Stop. Bring her. What the fuck is bring her supposed to mean?
So even that message isn't just from Sam's corruption. Josh on the alt station had the same goal, and he's not an AI, in case you didn't know. I can also disprove this theory from a developer intention standpoint.
Things like 2001.
2001: A Space Odyssey being their primary influence actually explains a lot about the story and why it's structured the way it is. I had never seen that movie, so while researching this one, I decided to watch it. What did I think of the movie? I thought it was great. For 1968. As a human living in 2020, I thought it was awful. Am I allowed to say that? Regardless of my thoughts on the movie, there are clearly some inspirations in the story for observation. In that movie, there are these big black monoliths that appear at significant story junction points, but their origin and goal is unknown. Sound familiar? There are some prevailing theories, of course, but even their motives in that moment they appear as unclear. They either enact a technological change in the observing party, or they themselves are there to observe a technological change. But either way, the movie doesn't make it clear. That's what No Code was doing with these Hex events. Except I believe the purpose for their appearance is to facilitate long-term goals in their avatars, that being Sam on our version of Lost, and Josh on the alternate version, and who knows how many different versions of this story played out with different avatars each time in alternate universes. But they do really exist, just like the monoliths did. Okay, so what about Emma? Well, my comment about her not manipulating objects that aren't connected to Sam is also just a bold-faced lie. She puts out a fire with a fire extinguisher. So unless there is some serious visual trickery going on here, my theory falls apart right out of the gate. But just to prove my point, let's keep going. Multiple characters in the same breath refer to Emma and Sam as different entities.
Over here.
Why would I go out the airlock without a suit?
Because he opened the fucking door on you.
She fixes multiple cameras for you as well as other things throughout the game. And probably worst of all, if Emma isn't alive when the game begins, where is her body? There is no in-game explanation for where she would be if the Emma we see is just an image made up by Sam, and in fact, the existence of this message in her bunk seems to imply she would be dead in her bunk if anywhere. This is a pretty glaring plot hole if my theory is correct. Now, if my theory is true, it does handily explain the helmet crack and her surviving in space for so long. But like I said, that's just using flaws in the game to justify other flaws, like this graphical glitch. If this graphical glitch means something, then what about this one? Or this one? Maybe this one. What does this one mean? Is this jankiness also significant somehow? Not to mention, the game doesn't do anything with this concept, even if it's true. The events still play out the exact same way as they do. They don't change the implications in any real way. It can be a fun thing to think about, but at the end of the day, it doesn't explain the ending. It doesn't explain the aliens or their plans, or why they want Emma herself. Speaking of the ending, it being deliberately vague is probably also the point. Again, let's look at 2001: A Space Odyssey for evidence. That movie has one of the most debated endings in movie history, pardon the hyperbole, due to its intense vagueness. It has numerous different interpretations because it doesn't commit to any one of them. There's nothing wrong with that, but at the end of the day, the ending is what you make it, just like Observation. Now, just to be clear, Observation seems to be setting up for a sequel, whereas 2001 makes no such attempt. But based on tweets from No Code, it seems to me that they are moving on to something different. I could be wrong about that, and maybe the second game will come out and prove my theories are here correct. I don't really know. But if my theories about this game are correct, then there are just as many plot holes and inconsistencies in the story as if it's more straightforward. Now on to Sam, and the game's biggest goal. What's it like being an evil AI? What was going through Hal's brain when he did all the things he did? Well, the funny thing is, no one will ever actually know what it's like to be an evil AI. I know that sounds dumb, but it's true. That is something no human being will ever understand, barring some weird technological marvel sometime in the future. So for all I know, Observation's depiction of this idea is actually quite good. But I have a few reasons as to why I feel that it actually isn't a very good exploration of the evil AI trope. Before I get to them though, let's look at Hal a little bit more. Am I crazy in saying that I don't think his motivations are incredibly complicated? Here we go. Step by step through his story, he proclaims he is perfect, then he makes a mistake but blames it on the humans. Then, when he finds out the humans are going to disconnect him, he decides that the mission is being threatened by the humans, and he decides that killing them will be better for the mission than letting them live. When Dave goes to disconnect him, he then begs for his life, not out of a legitimate repentance, but because he thinks it's the only way to complete the mission. Am I wrong on any of that? It feels like it's pretty straightforward to me, as long as you spend some time thinking about the events from his perspective, limited as it may be. All that to say that I think 2001 already did a decent job of exploring this concept. Not that there isn't more room to explore, but just that it already has that element to it. Now as for Sam, let's look at it from two perspectives. The baseline idea is looking at why Sam would choose to do certain things, like killing Jim just as an example. I believe it's trying to pull the player into that as well, having you make difficult decisions, right? That's what it seems like from these interviews.
And they make these kind of weird moral choices that as humans we don't make, and I was like, well, what's that like to put the player in that situation?
Well, firstly, if the theories I presented are correct, then the game is putting a barrier between the player and their actions in the form of evil AI Sam. The player themselves aren't making the decisions, but are being guided through them by the cognition Sam has created in order to manipulate them. Which means that the game's goal of exploring why an AI would do something like killing Jim isn't really explored in any actuality. You as a player are just following orders, and Sam's true intentions are still hidden. Now, if my theories are wrong, the game puts a barrier between the player and their actions in the form of Emma and the Hex aliens. They give you very clear directions which you must follow in order to continue the story. This creates a disconnect between their actions and their consequences, in the same way that a tutorial telling you to jump won't make you think about the ramifications of jumping, just that it's something you probably should be doing. If, after a 3D platformer was over, a message popped up saying, "Every time you jumped you killed a kitten. Feel good, you monster?" Would you consider the player at fault or the tutorial for giving simple directions and hiding the consequences? Now what if the tutorial said every time you jump, you kill a kitten, but the game gave you no choice but to jump? The moral compass is understood, but in order to experience the game, the player must do something they feel is wrong. Who is at fault then? You may say, well, someone that follows the orders of a superior to kill a man is still at fault for killing the man. But when the game doesn't give you the option to not jump in order to complete the game, then the moralistic nature of this question goes out the window. Observation forces you into all these decisions beyond any sense of moral compass you may have, even if you disagree with the decision. The only way to uphold a moral compass within this game is to not play it, and there's absolutely no indication that that may be something the game even wants of you, and I would argue that no game should want that from you if you haven't experienced the whole thing first at least. There are games that have done this sort of thing well. Undertale did it very well, exploring the actions you take and their consequences over the course of 3 playthroughs you can do in that game. Silly as it may be, I actually think Doki Doki Literature Club did this as well, questioning the player and their reasoning as to why they wanted to play a game like that in the first place, and maybe you were the monster for downloading it at all. This game does not, because there is no questioning of the moral compass of the main character or the player at any point. Even something like BioShock reprimands the main character and, by extension, the player for blindly following the orders of the voice in his head. MGS2 did this as well. Discussions can be had over whether or not it was done well in both of those cases, but I think those are good examples of how this sort of story typically plays out. Even in Sam's case, removing the player from the equation, he doesn't know why any of it's happening either, and he never makes a choice that isn't somehow initiated by a character outside himself, usually Emma or the Hex aliens. To be completely fair to No Code, this is something that has been historically incredibly difficult to get right. Games that question the moral compass of the main character or the player are more often than not botched by poor execution or gameplay that segregates you from the consequences of your actions, or simply don't put enough time into exploring those consequences, similarly to my 3D platformer example from before. I believe the successful exploration of this concept would require a much more open-ended story, which changes drastically given your decisions, and each decision is something that has no clear right answer. In his example, McKellen says,
When there's someone trapped behind the door and the AI have locked the door down, the person's going to die, and the other one goes, "Damn you, open the door," and they don't open the door. Right, the AI is evil, and you go, "You bastard," and you're going to take down the computer. But from the computer's point of view, it's like, no, if I open that door, you're all going to die, so I'm going to let that person die.
Which is one of those morally ambiguous kill 5 people on a train to save 1 or kill 1 person on the tracks to save 5 type situations. If there were, let's say, 4 decisions like that throughout the game, then we'd have a better basis for the story to question the moral ambiguity of an evil AI in the way McKellen pictured. Because as it is, both Sam and the player are just blindly following orders. It's kind of funny. On one hand, it seems as though No Code got lost in their primary goals story-wise while developing this game. And yet, this interview with McKellen came out in May 28th of 2019, after the game had already come out. I obviously haven't spoken with McKellen myself, but I have to wonder if he feels he accomplished everything he set out to. If the game turned out from a story perspective in the way he had always envisioned it. Maybe it borrowed a little too much from 2001: A Space Odyssey, being too vague or directionless to serve the primary goals it had. From a gameplay perspective, I believe this game is a crowning, bafflingly amazing achievement in immersion and depth, perfectly putting the player in the soul of an AI who is just as confused as they are. It's just a shame that it seems like the story couldn't keep up with that level of quality.